The following podcast is brought to you by CDkeyoffer.com. Use offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% on all Microsoft software, and also use offer code BrokenSilicon to get $30 off the minis from MSA1, and then also use Broken Silicon to get 10% off tasty Vite Ramen and other fantastic Vite products. And we'll talk about these sponsors more later, but for now, let's just get on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom. And, today we'll be doing an episode that I don't feel like we've done for a while. That is maybe a bit less gamer-centric and just more macro levels and server-centric. Although we certainly go into that with Wendell, too. But I think it's important to do these types of episodes from time to time, simply because I think it's easy to forget that you can get very tunnel vision and look at gaming performance and how gaming products are competing and forget that they are really just like one tip of the spear or maybe back of the spear to what is the main product that makes these companies function. And if this, server, these products are performing well for a company down the road, contrary to what some people think, that's probably going to lead to more and better gaming products because they'll have the money to actually fund those gaming products. So I've had this person on a few times before, but it's been over a year since you've been on. So please fully introduce yourself again, tell people what you do, and please tell people about your work history.
Hi, yes, I've worked in servers for going on 24 years. Been doing it for a very long time. Worked in different aspects of servers, from corporate IT to enterprise computing to SaaS. I'm now currently working in a company that does kind of it's not really web-based. It's a different type of infrastructure and security-based, but they operate a pretty significantly sized CDN type of infrastructure. So that's a more different type of work than I've done in the past, but it's not that much different. And I've done, and it's a very critical piece of infrastructure that about a third of the internet websites uses. If we go down, you'll notice it. You'll be on CNN. It will unfortunately be on CNN in a bad way, like CrowdStrike.
Mm-hmm. Well, you bring up CrowdStrike. I mean, let me ask you, what do you think about what happened there? I mean, I never paid that much attention to it just because there's been so much other news going on that I've had to cover. And somehow it didn't affect me, although it, of course, affected millions of people around the world. I mean, my understanding is they just had one wrong file in there and put it in an update or something. What do you think about that type of mistake?
It's actually sadly common. That situation was just that there was a mistake and it slipped through the QA process. I've seen that before. It's always a constant battle to tighten up the QA process. You have automated testing suites, and you do regression testing to make sure that any problem that you solved in the past don't reappear again. Customers really don't forgive you for that. Now, I don't do the QA as much. That's not my core line of work. But again, I work in these industry, in this field, and I interact with many different types of teams and groups and types of people and their roles. So I'm familiar with what they do. It's unfortunately, it does happen. I've experienced it too. The real mistake isn't so much the fact that this mistake had slipped through, but rather on the customer side, that they just simply allowed that update to blast right through.
Right. You would think they would have tested it on one computer first or something.
You never just accept an update from a vendor, any product from anyone, vendor, hardware, software, anyone, without first doing validation and a slow testing rollout. You just don't do it. We actually use CrowdStrike here. At the place I'm at, they use CrowdStrike, but for Linux. This incident really impacted Windows, so we're not impacted. But every place I've been to and the way I've done things, this organization also does a slow rollout to it. They just test it. They do a 40-hour burn-in to make sure that there's no problems and then when they roll out, because of the sensitive nature of this company and the impact that this company can have, they do it very slow. It takes weeks for them to roll out updates.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very, very careful about it because of the potential impact.
I think this is probably a good time to jump in and say, too, that you are going to be anonymous as you have been every other time you've been on the podcast. That's not because of any real major issue. It's just, why not be anonymous, right? Like, and your views are your own, not your company's. Like, it's not like there's a real problem with the company or anything. It's just you would prefer to be anonymous and your views are your own. Let me jump in here with this question here to start things off. Another Chris writes in and said, did you ever have a scenario where you saw a significant decrease in performance from one generation to another, running the same software and OS on an updated server?
I saw that question. I'm not sure exactly what he means by that.
Well, you know what? I think I do know what he's probably getting at here. There's been a lot of really consternation around the Zen 5 launch to consumers over the past couple weeks. And that's because there were some scenarios where they saw Zen 5 underperforming Zen 4. Now, there's a lot of websites investigating this. Like, I know Phoronix just looked into Linux versus Windows performance, found that Zen 5 does, especially in applications, perform at least a bit better on average in Linux than Windows. Clearly, Windows isn't fully optimized, or I should say, fully utilizing Zen 5 correctly. Whether that's Microsoft's fault or AMD's fault with their launch code, I don't know. But I think that might be what another Chris was getting at, is some people were kind of shocked to see some apps perform worse in Zen 5 than Zen 4. So I'm just curious what you think about that. It sounds like you've never really seen that in your work, but I wonder if you have any opinions about Zen 5 in general right now.
I like the fact that it's more efficient for the same performance. That's the part that I really like. The biggest problem, I remember last year when we discussed about Zen 4, I was not happy with Zen 4, and that's because of its power consumption. Both AMD and Intel, with their Sapphire Rapids, they just drove the power consumption of their chips just to the moon. And one of the biggest problems we have in data centers is power capacity. Even if you can afford to pay for the power, we just can't get them because they can't build the power lines into the data center. That's the biggest challenge for data centers today. And it's why I'm always harping on energy efficiency and not just having just straight up performance.
Which they seem to have focused on heavily with Zen 5 this time around. Yeah, I think with Zen 4, it actually got a notable IPC increase and a couple of cool features. But I really think that from Zen 1 to Zen 3, you saw this situation where, like, I saw some testing where Zen 1 and Zen Plus didn't really gain performance past, I believe it was 4.5 gigahertz, which was odd. And then Zen 2 was like 4.7. Zen 3 was about 5 gigahertz. So you had this scaling issue of, like, I think people hear IPC, which really is not a perfect term at all. It maybe should be retired, if I'm being honest. And they think, 15% or 16% higher IPC. That means at 6 gigahertz, it will also be this much faster. It'll be the clock speed boost times that. That really wasn't happening before Zen 4. AMD wasn't even getting more performance past a certain speed. And I believe old Intel architectures like Skylake didn't really scale past like around 6-ish gigahertz too. And I think with Zen 4, they said at some point we need to solve the scaling issue. I know it's going to use more energy, but Intel's already using way more energy than us. And at some point, one of these architectures just needs to solve getting more performance at really high clock speeds. And that's what they tried to do. And so with Zen 5, I think you can see they're going much more back to, can we just get higher performance per watt?
And for us, I really like that. That's a big problem. That's also, I suspect, why AMD extended the lifespan of Zen 3. Because, again, like I said before, I never buy the first refresh of a new platform generation. We're in the DDR5 generation. From a cost-benefit analysis based on our use case, that the DDR4 generation still financially is a better value for our use case scenario than DDR5. So for my next refresh in 2026, I'm looking at Zen 3 still, because it's more for the DDR4, and because you're looking at about $10,000 difference in terms of per terabyte of RAM between the two, DDR5 versus DDR4. And that's with using, and no, don't go to Newegg or any of those other sites for
You're saying like getting quotes for actually large purchasing
through the proper channels. It's going to be that large of a difference. And for us, memory, like straight up memory performance isn't the most important. It's memory capacity that's more important. And in fact, the Zen 2 Epic CPU from a performance standpoint is already sufficient. So getting Zen 3, we're not going to get that much benefit from the extra performance, but we're going to still get the benefit of having cheaper memory. And for us, actually, it's the number of DIMM slots on a motherboard that actually matters more than the CPUs now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was speaking with you offline the other day, and I've heard this from other people as well, though, so it's not really surprising, but I do think it's something worth reminding people. Like, all the time, people on the Moore's Law is Dead Discord will or in a reader mail for a podcast will ask, why is AMD launching new Zen 3 products? And it's like, well, because they're still ramping server, and so some of those yields need to go to gamers that don't meet validation with lower voltage on server. And they're still launching Zen 3. Like, what is this now? Are we at we're 4 years later? Because I hear that the Zen 3 server production is still increasing every year, that it's wildly popular, and that for the most part, people are buying 32 and 48 core parts, right?
32 up to 64.
They're between 32 and 64.
And, and the reason is that if you take a look at, say, Bergamo at 128 core, the problem is that the applications, they're using a lot more memory. So I have to have 16 gigs per core or 8 gigs per thread. So if you take 128 cores multiplied by 16, how much is that? That's what, 2 terabytes?
Right. I see what
2
you're
terabytes
saying.
of RAM, you're looking at $20,000 just for the memory on each server.
Now, I have a question for you. It's something I thought about in preparing the notes for this podcast is, and I talked about it with people in the Moore's Law Dead Discord. I told them that I was speaking with you, that you said between 32 and 64 cores is what's actually the most popular still. Some other people, who are in the Moore's Law Dead Discord, by supporting us on Patreon. Surprise, a lot of them also work in server. And they also said the same thing. They parroted what you said. Yeah, that's what people want. And it made me think, I'm preparing, of course, leaks for Zen 6 Venice, things that I hear about that going up to 256 cores. But I hear about a lot of, I guess I'm laying the cat out of the bag here a little bit. I hear a lot of the focus is still probably going to be on 128 core and lower models for Zen 6. And after hearing you say that, seeing other people at Moore's Law Dead Discord back you up on that, it makes me wonder, I wonder after Zen 6, how much they really should be pushing for more cores, because it seems like most server customers, or at least quite a large amount of them, don't need more than 256 cores per socket.
You're limited by memory.
Unless you want just a single socket system, which might become more popular,
Yeah, single socket is great if you want to have, you don't want to have multiple NUMA domains, non-uniform memory access. That's a big issue on the Intels because when you have dual sockets, if you need to have uniform memory, you're going to have to slow down the processor on both sides versus, say, a single socket. That's why really, really low latency systems are always going to be single sockets, which is low latency computing is not my area of expertise, but I know people that's their livelihood. So for me, it's more about having a lot of cores and threads, but the number of cores and threads is ultimately limited by how much memory you can stuff in there into the machine. So if you're going to want 128 cores or 256 cores, you're looking at 2 and 4 terabytes. But if you're limited to, in the DDR5 generations, 12 DIMM slots, you're looking at 256 gigs per DIMM or 500 gigs per DIMM. You're now pushing a 2U system up to close to $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. And at that point, the CapEx cost no longer makes sense. Just buy a bunch of 2U systems with 32, 64 cores, and the increased power cost won't overtake the amount of the operation cost, won't overcome the sheer high CapEx cost due to the price of the memory. That's why when we select CPUs, it's usually it's very rarely we pick the CPU for the CPUs themselves. It's really the stuff around the system that we pick that leads us to the right CPU. Very rarely do we pick the CPU for its internal features. The very rare case that we actually did do that was the SME and SEEV in the EPYC processors. That's a real feature that the processor have that we choose EPYC for those features because of our use case.
Chris Rich writes in, and he says, taking a basic high-level look at server processors, AMD has their standard cores and then their denser C cores derived from them. Intel, though, has distinct P and E cores, and a number of companies have ARM server processors, which basically are just all dense cores as far as I can tell. Do you prefer a few strong cores or a lot of denser cores? Do you prefer AMD's approach or Intel's approach, or are they, in your opinion, about the same, or what differentiates them to you?
I personally like the denser cores. Again, we don't operate a lot of single-threaded type of applications. A lot of it is mostly multi-threaded or very small applications that you run very, very frequently. The smaller cores, the smaller, denser cores lends itself to having more volume. We are focused on more transaction volume, not so much just sheer performance. So that's why having lots of cores really matters. Also, I do want to point out that having different types of core sizes in the same chips, I don't like that because you now put the onus on the scheduling on the OS, and now you introduce more bugs. If you have bugs in the OS, in the kernel, with the scheduling, you can have unpredictable performance that's going to be almost impossible to troubleshoot. It's just fundamentally a bad design. I just feel like,
at least for enterprise, yeah.
Yeah, and basically, and this is something that kind of irks me is when Intel says they have 24 cores, but when you look deeper into that, they only have, 8 cores? If you actually look at their list of processors, since I think their 9900K, they haven't really had more than 8 cores, although I could be wrong on that. But by and large,
they had some, like Broadwell went up to 10 cores.
Yeah.
It was a $1,700 processor. Mainstream, no, not really.
Yeah, they
Comet Lake went to 10, I guess, but yeah.
But by and large, they have not gone. In my view, I only count their P cores. Okay, so it's 8 cores, so they have not gone beyond 8 cores, and all that E cores, I don't count that. So to me, it's
even for server, like I know that Intel was considering with Sierra Forest going to 528 cores. They canceled the biggest project. Like, how would that? Now they're only going up to going up to 288 cores.
Same size cores. If you're going to have 500 E cores, that's okay. It's a 500 core. It's when you try to combine your E and P cores together, where they're clearly different sizes. They're not the same, and I don't treat them the same. And you shouldn't call them, combine the number of core counts. To me, it's a little deceptive advertising on the part of Intel.
So it sounds like you wish, I hear, and other people have said it before me, that there's something coming out next year called Bartlett Lake. It goes just 12 P cores, no E cores on LGA 1700. I wonder if you think that should be their approach more so on desktop, is like, instead of 8 plus 16, just do 12 big ones, but then also maybe have a 48 core E-core option.
Don't count that. Don't count that in your marketing.
No, but I mean, it sounds like you think it should be one or the other. Like, you wish you could choose a 12 core or a 48 core, all E-core. Like, you wish you could, let you make the decision.
Yeah, don't combine the two, because now you put the you create the risk in on the OS. Now in desktops, you probably can get away with it, but servers, absolutely not. I would never. If I see a Xeon with that kind of config, that's an absolute no-go.
Well, and the rumor is that Bartlett Lake is focused on embedded. So there you go. Like, this is not for desktop, and now they're going to all P cores, right? That makes sense.
That's the way it should be.
I mean, let me skip ahead. Let's see. Kiln God writes in and says, given AMD added proper support for AVX 512 and Zen 5, do you believe this will improve AMD's position in the data center? Also, does AMD versus Intel versus ARM matter, with the likes of Amazon making their own server CPUs as well? And have you heard any word on Apple making servers?
Apple, if they try to do it, they will fail. Apple's not a server maker.
So, but I've heard they were working on server chips actually for years, not just from people that work with people at Apple, but also there were some internal AMD documents I saw. This was years ago, around when I leaked Bergamo, where they said their internal presentations at AMD, they weren't even considering Intel. They were comparing their CPUs to what they're projecting Apple would do. Now, the funny thing is since then, I have not heard, it's basically been crickets, except every now and then someone says Apple's going to make a server CPU.
I don't see that. It's not in their DNA.
You don't think so? I mean, their cores are performing pretty well on laptop, though.
There's more to becoming a server company, a server vendor, than just having the cores.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, when we look at Qualcomm launching their ARM
business
laptops,
processes is designed to handle consumers. Enterprises have different requirements and different expectations.
Yeah, I like what I was saying is if you look at Qualcomm launching ARM laptops, one of the major issues I've heard from the likes of people who work at like Amazon, Best Buy, Micro Center, they say that like the support isn't there from Qualcomm because they're not used to launching tons of laptops. Like updates, like customers are asking when there will be a next GPU update, and the drivers, they're like, we don't know. OEMs I talk to say the support for launching, like an HP Qualcomm laptop just isn't there for what AMD and Intel would provide.
This is why the market tends to go with the incumbents, is really because of how the companies manage the product life cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And how does the life cycles tailor to the needs of the market. And the needs of a consumer market is vastly different than that of the server market.
Mm-hmm.
And Apple is really built around the consumer base, not around the enterprise base. And so they basically have to have a completely different culture. And it's that cultural difference that's not going to allow Apple to succeed. Not so much the core. They can build cores that are really good, but you need everything else around the cores.
Right. Like to be able to sell your products like they're a yearly commodity, not like it's some special new launch, tablet or something. I mean, long term, do you think they could build up though? Because I mean, I think most people expect that they would make their own servers first, then maybe get one customer, and the next year try to get a second, and then over 10 years try to have a small amount of market share.
If they're going to try to do that, it's going to be very niche within their walled garden.
Yeah. I can see that though. I could see that being niche.
I do not want to speculate. I don't see any evidence of it. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to engage in that kind of projection. It's just, given what we've seen so far, I'd say no until they actually release something and actually they are going to do it. They're going to describe their strategy. And remember Apple's famously secretive mm-hmm. company. That's not something we like in the enterprise space. We like to know so we can plan things out.
Oh, that's another good point. Yeah. Yeah, they don't really tell you anything. It's like
we don't want to get caught by surprise.
I think I leaked something about the Ultra M3 or M3 Ultra. I don't remember what it was, or maybe it was M2 Ultra years ago. I rarely do Apple leaks, but I actually got one first, and it was somewhat of a big deal simply because it was like a few months before they announced it, and that was made me first, I believe, if I remember correctly. But it's funny when you look at when I leak something about AMD or Intel first, it's like 3 years before it comes out, and server customers are going to want to know, like, you can't hide it from us. What's happening in 3 years?
Yeah, we have to at least have an idea of what your roadmaps are.
Mm-hmm.
So the level of transparency and disclosure you need to get into and maintain your standings in the data center market. Just Apple does not have the correct culture for that.
Mm-hmm.
They're built on basically surprising the consumer market, which are more moved by the flashing, kind of like the bells and whistles. We're more interested in the financial numbers.
Mm-hmm.
These are just, again, like I said in the past, these are business tools. They're there to make money. And anything that's unknown, we consider as a financial risk.
All Jesse wants is for Maurice to play with her more often. But unfortunately, he just does not give out playtime or kisses for as low of a rate as she does. And I think she's just going to have to deal with that. But do you know what you don't have to deal with? paying too much for Microsoft software if you go to CDkeyoffer.com. This piece of content is sponsored by CDkeyoffer.com and their back to school sale. Whether it's Microsoft operating systems, Office products, or even many of the latest games, CDkeyoffer.com provides PC gamers with a product this community deserves. Amongst endlessly elevating component costs, fair pricing on Microsoft keys is one thing that we at least should get, I think. And you know, the Moore's Law is Dead team has been working with CDkeyoffer.com for a very long time. And that's because they're good to me, good to Dan, good to about a dozen family members of friends of mine that have used their services. And they've been really, really good, most importantly, to the Moore's Law is Dead community. So support this channel by using offer code BrokenSilicon to save 25% off Microsoft software, or you can also use Die Shrink to save 3% off everything else on the website like games. Using either of those codes really helps the channel a ton, and it helps save you money. So use those codes BrokenSilicon and Die Shrink at CDkeyoffer.com today. Well, speaking of financial risks, let me ask you this question. Chris Rich writes in, and he says, for quite a while now, Intel's data center group has been making meager profits. By itself, that alone, the amount of money they make, does that make you significantly less willing to buy their products? What do you think of their roadmap for servers? Is there anything you think they should do that they aren't already doing, or alternatively, something that they should stop doing?
They should really listen to their customers and actually build chips that we would want to have. They're putting out chips with the accelerators, like I said in the past. Over 90+% of the enterprise application aren't going to take advantage of that stuff. And so why should we pay for that stuff if we don't use it?
Yeah. Wendell at Level 1 Techs told me like a couple of years ago too, when Sapphire Rapids, maybe it was a year ago when Sapphire Rapids was first coming out, that at least the overwhelming majority of people he was speaking with in server just were not interested in the accelerators at all, especially the licensing thing. I heard that
angers us too. Yeah, that angers us too. It's like it's like you try to put a paywall there. You know, we're still paying for the silicon because that stuff is still there, and then you're going to ask us to rent because we're already paying for the power for that to power that dead silicon.
So. I mean, but the question Chris was asking, I think is interesting in and of itself, of just the money, just the fact that when you look at their revenue going down, them cutting parts of the company, it doesn't seem like financially they're on good footing. Does that fact alone make you cautious in buying Intel server products or giving them a big win at a company? Because you have to think about this. Well, if we're worried about Intel being around in 5 years, couldn't that be a risk just to choose them because of that alone?
That's why you see in the past, AMD and Intel's data center revenue has kind of rose and fallen pretty much at the same pace, by and large, at the same time. This Q2 earnings, this is probably the first time I actually am worried about Intel, because now you see a divergence of the revenue between Intel and AMD in terms of the data center. That tells you that AMD's taking revenue share. Now, I'm going to be honest, in terms of market share, Intel is probably going to still have the majority of the market.
Yeah.
But you have to ask yourself, what type of processors are they selling in terms of servers? If you look at their revenue versus their market share of volume of units shipped, they're selling only the cheap stuff. They're not selling the more profitable stuff. And that shows you a lack of confidence. If AMD is selling less units than Intel, but is selling at higher prices, okay, that tells you that, one, AMD is making bigger profit margins, but more importantly is that companies are trusting AMD. And this is the first time I have to actually now have real evidence, hey, things are changing. Even if AMD may not win the market share. In fact, I hate to use market share because you basically are assuming the entire market is monolithic. It is not. There are different parts of the server market. They're not all the same. They have different requirements, different priorities, and so they are going to need different types of products. And here's the other thing that you may not think about. These big core counts chips, it's condensing people's infrastructure. So when I replace my Xeons with the EPYC, one Xeon or one EPYC can knock out, if I can remember, at least about 7 to 8 Xeon dual socket Xeons.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot less Xeons you need to buy for one EPYC chip. So even if AMD, you're buying fewer AMD chips, those fewer AMD chips can do the work of many, many more Intel chips.
Yeah. Well, and Intel's been like marketing Sierra Forest, their 144E core server chip is having the ability to do that. But like I think you're saying here, you imagine, I mean, compare how much that probably costs to produce versus these simpler looking AMD models they're already selling with Zen 4
Even
or
they have a little more
Bergamo.
latency than Intel.
Yeah. And you think that AMD, like, that probably cost them less to make the chip competing with that. And at the same time, you go, well, when I look at Intel's revenue, they're not making a big profit margin on this. So if I invest in these Sierra Forest server chips, I'm worried that by the time Clearwater Forest comes out, they're going to be a skeleton crew that I'm buying from.
That's I'm sure that's happening. After the Q2 earnings, you're now seeing this on the financial media. Now it's now becoming known in the financial world. Like even guys like that lunatic on CNBC, that kind of bald guy with a beard on CNBC.
I'm blanking on his name, but I know who you mean.
Yeah, he would. He actually tells people to avoid Intel, to get out of Intel. So if it's making to guys like him, it's bad. And then also I think there's another analyst saying that he's talking to investors and fund managers, saying that they're getting calls about Intel. So things are not looking good.
Yeah, I listen to the Prof G Markets podcast every Monday, and it was hosted by Scott Galloway. And it's very interesting on a recent episode, a major story. They analyze the markets, what's up, what's down, and what are the major stories with major companies. And Intel was like half of the episode, and they never talk about, Intel or AMD there. And they talk about Nvidia sometimes because, of course, they're skyrocketing. But
it even made it to some precious metals podcast too.
Really? Oh. Yeah, I mean, it's making it everywhere. It's crazy.
It's getting outside the technology industry. It's getting outside of it. That's not a good sign. There are discussions in companies, like in the technology space, about solvency risk of Intel. Both companies who are buying servers and OEMs that depend on them. I mean, right now they're just kind of steady, but I, for one, will not buy any kind of new features from them. If I have to buy Intel, which I'm not, but if I had to, it'll just simply to run the applications, because those applications run on Intel. So you just simply replace it with the same thing. So you're kind of treading water at that point, but you're not buying into Intel's newfangled stuff, because at that point now you're making a bet on Intel.
Yeah, that was the other aspect of what you said that I didn't touch on here or didn't respond to, is you're saying it's not just like, you don't want to buy the expensive stuff because you're worried about their future, but it's also like you don't want to buy into their newer features because you're not sure if those features will matter in 5 years if Intel isn't around. And when you see someone buy a 192 core Turin CPU and trying to use all their accelerators, it's like they're in on AMD. They think AMD is going to be here for 5 years. But if you see someone going in and saying, hey, give me a 32 core, 24 core Sapphire Rapids chip, and I don't want the accelerator at all, what they're saying is, I'm spending the minimum I need to keep this going. I'm not investing in a bigger future with Intel.
Correct. Yes. And when I saw the Q2 earnings of AMD, that was the first time when I saw it like literally doubled. The data center just doubled. That was like, that's a shock. That was, I believe that this was the earnings season that AMD has really come of age in the server space, because yes, they have, you've got the crazy AI bubble that's going on. Everyone's just spending stupid money on this thing that they don't really understand how to actually make money on. But what I'm seeing is that the industry is coalescing around Nvidia GPUs and AMD CPUs. Okay, if they were coalescing around Intel Xeon CPUs, we would have seen their revenues go up commensurate with Nvidia. So Nvidia goes up, AMD goes up, but Intel is not. That means the industry, the hyperscalers, are coalescing around for their high performance computing around Nvidia GPUs and AMD CPUs. And once that model is set, they are not going to change for at least a decade, maybe 15 years at least.
Mm-hmm.
So any kind of future replacement, they're going to go with the same thing. That industry has already selected AMD as the primary server vendor, and they're not going to change from that, at least for a decade.
You know, I have a question here that was also by Chris asking, like, touching on the last time you were on the podcast over a year ago, where you said AMD you think they're going to get to 40% market share by 2026. And once they get to that looks like 50%. So people are going to be very comfortable switching, seeing them be that much of a percentage of the market. And it seems like they're on track to get there even faster than that. So I don't want to get bogged down into like, if you think that's going to continue, because I suspect your answer is yes. But what I want to ask is, like, how do you think this has happened though? And who do you think is to blame? Because at Intel, I can tell you internally, they like Pat Gelsinger. They believe in Pat Gelsinger. Honestly, though, their support's waning a little bit now that they're taking food out of the break rooms. But what I said in a conversation on the Moore's Law Discord recently is my concern about Pat Gelsinger's future at Intel isn't really about Intel employees calling for him to step down. My concern would be not like the layman or like a casual investor, but even hedge funds who follow 100 technology companies. Intel is one of the companies that maybe they have an index that they're involved in, and they don't know why it might or might not be Pat Gelsinger's fault that something happens. But what they're going to do is they're going to look at and go, who is the current CEO? Pat Gelsinger. Ever since he took over, things haven't been going well. And whether it's his fault or not, like, I think at a certain point, people are going to call for him to step down just by looking at the numbers and the trajectory since he's been in charge. And they said that on the the Scott Galloway podcast.
Yes. You know,
in the mainstream.
Yep. Unfortunately, there's a loss of confidence. I still want to give him at least another year, especially with Raptor Lake. I think it's still too soon. I think a lot of problems really is just underneath, like the middle management really underneath.
Me too.
Yeah, that's really, I think, where a lot of the problems is really had. They have to prioritize the company as a single unit and not just, what's good for my group. They got to stop the feudalism and the fiefdom in that area, in that part of the company, the management layer, which is below the C-suite. So that's where I believe the problem is at. I don't work at Intel. I don't know anything about it. I just see it from the outside, based on my experience working in other companies. I kind of like, that's my sense. I could be wrong though, but
yeah, an example I can give is someone at Intel. I won't say where they worked at Intel, what group, or even what level they were at, but they said that their team, basically all smart people, like half of them have PhDs. They're brilliant, but they went through like 5. I don't remember what the exact number was. There's like 5 managers in like 2 years, and the last one was terrible, and half the team quit because they're just tired of dealing with this person. And I've heard similar stories to that amongst other people as well. I think it should be no surprise to some people. Some of my current sources at AMD and Nvidia, and actually other companies as well, they're all former Intel employees. Well, not all of them, but like a lot of them are becoming former Intel employees because of how many people are leaving. And it's a common thing I hear. New manager every year or two. The last one's terrible, and I left. And I don't know how they get out of this cycle, because I think if you want to make the most money, you're going to go to Apple or Nvidia, and then after that, maybe AMD and Samsung.
You need strong leadership. I think that's really. I think we're seeing the weak, probably the Achilles heels of Pat Gelsinger. He doesn't seem to be such a strong leader. Basically says it's just that the middle manager don't take him seriously.
All right, so I want to bring this up because I know this was something else you wanted to talk about as well. Resident Mexican writes in and says, "Hello, Tom and guests. So with Intel's recent failures annihilating any trust gamers have for them with Raptor Lake, is the server market having the same reaction to these failures as the gaming market has? Are server clients scrambling to get off Intel, or is it more subdued?" I think this is an interesting question because, there are Raptor Lake chips used in servers. I don't believe you are familiar with, or you use them at all, but it's been mostly a gamer issue or a specific type of gaming server issue with the Raptor Lake failures. But has that shooken your confidence in Intel or anyone else you work with in Intel as well?
We already been through it with Spectre and Meltdown. We've already been through it. So it's now the client side that's now facing what we had faced 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
For once, one thing is that we don't consider Raptor Lake CPUs. Those are consumer grade CPUs. We do not consider them servers. Servers have certain types of features, and one of it is the memory subsystem. We use RDIMM. The Raptor Lake, either they used, I think DDR5, they are now able to use ECC more readily, but they're still unbuffered DIMMs. So the memory subsystem is substantially different. Also, there's a lot more validation that goes into Xeons and Epics more than the consumer grade CPUs. So for us, we use Xeons. All the places I go to, places and the people I work with, they're all Xeons or Epics. Never a Ryzen or their Core i anything. To use a Core i anything, it's going to be a very much in server type environment. It's going to be very much a very niche. Basically, if you need super high single core performance in a low latency applications, that's pretty much the only thing I could think of. And even that, they don't really scale well to a huge number of cores. So they're gonna still stick with Xeons or Epics. They're just not going to use the consumer grade CPUs. The only place outside the gaming world, which is again, I'm not as familiar with that world, the gaming server world. I just don't know that world that much, so if at all. But the only other place I do know that they do use something similar to Raptor Lake is in the HFT world, which is the high frequency trading world used by hedge funds and proprietary trading desks, because they need the low latency, high core performance, because they are trying to get their trades in faster than the other guys. Basically,
you actually had a guest on who does that. It was interesting.
Yes, I remember that. Yes,
it was a very good episode.
He's actually going to be a better authority than I would be.
QH Freddy writes in and he says, "How do you estimate the scale of Raptor Lake deployments and server side from game hosting?" Well, we've already covered that part of it, but let me continue to this part then. Also, what would you say are the most interesting similarities and differences between the Raptor Lake situation and the Spectre MDS situation?
The Raptor Lake is far worse because you have a limit, because you actually now have a limit lifespan of that chip. With Spectre, Meltdown, L1TF, even AMD, you can turn off if you set up your networks correctly, if you set up your networks in a way to protect your systems, which is what a lot of companies have done since Spectre Meltdown. You basically air gap them, you isolate them, you do the proper firewalling of the different security zones. And then you arrange your workloads in a way so that there's not as much, that there's minimal amount of sharing of hardware. You can actually run your Intel machines or AMDs without the mitigation. You can turn them off and get the performance back. So, and then you can get the full useful life out of the machines.
Right. I remember you saying you would have two sets of servers. These ones are air gapped, full performance, not an issue. And then we just have some that aren't air gapped that can interface, and then it's safe.
Yeah, you can definitely do that. It's just it's more equipment, more space, more power. That's why and for my use case, we don't want to spend that kind of money. It's unnecessary. It's more time and labor just to do the same thing. And I'm not going to have a vendor increase the cost of doing business.
But with Raptor Lake, the difference is you really can't do these mitigations. I mean, they have them, but they're still going to break. And I don't want to get into specifics because I haven't looked in it in depth enough to really have a firm opinion, but I'm already seeing some websites testing the Raptor Lake mitigations on chips that are partially degraded, and they still seem to be breaking, just slower.
Unfortunately, I think the problem is that when they built the chip in such a way to make it vulnerable, and you can't really, from what I've been hearing, you cannot fix that. So in that case, there's a limited lifespan of those chips. They're going to break at some point in time. And that's far worse because now you cannot get the full useful life out of your CPU. So in our case with servers, yes, we took a loss, but we're able to kind of claw back the losses through re-architecting the network. And then going forward, we can protect these servers from zero-day vulnerabilities as well. So there's some good that came out of it, and we're also more diligent on it, and so we can counteract the risk. The problem on the client side with the Raptor Lake, once you got a chip that's dying, there's no coming back from that. You're pretty much dead in the water.
Yeah, and I think what's the most terrible about it as well is, again, assuming these reports I've read about a little bit in the past couple of days remain true, which is that the mitigation they have is a Band-Aid, which I told everyone I think this is just a Band-Aid. I don't think it's actually fixing it.
I don't think you can fix it. No,
I don't either. I'm told by people at Intel that the rumor inside the company is that there is a fatal flaw in the ring bus, that they rushed validation, that they really pushed too many cores onto this design and clocked the ring bus too high, and that
it was bad from the get-go.
And the fact that they're still breaking with this mitigation, the reason that's so terrible is that tells you they really still don't know what to do, right? Which would give me such a crisis of confidence in their next products.
I don't think there's anything they can do.
Well, I think, I'll be honest, I think what they can do is just be more aggressive. What's going on right now is I think they dropped it from like 1.6 volt peak to like 1.55 volts. And I think they need to probably drop it to around 1.5, 1.4 volts. The problem is they know if they do that, they're just taking away 10%, 20% performance. And I think what they're trying to do is have their cake and eat it too, where they're like, oh, it now breaks in 2 years or in 1 year instead of 3 months, but we just have enough performance to look competitive against AMD, when they just need to take the L and drop that performance 20% so they don't break.
And probably give them a little coupon for the next processor.
Yeah.
They don't have to give them full price, but at least something. But for losing the performance, but it's a really bad situation. I feel for those people, especially for the studios that actually have to use it for their livelihoods, like the gentleman from Australia.
From Alderon Games.
Yeah. It's, I mean, his experience is very similar to what we face with Spectre Meltdown, except he's probably had it a lot worse than us. For us, it's basically performance loss. We had to buy new servers. For him, I mean, he's basically having servers die on him in large numbers. And I know that his margins aren't very large. So he's, this is his livelihood and the livelihoods of his employees. And so it's just very, very demoralizing, to say the least.
It sounds like from your perspective, what you meant when you said, like, well, we dealt with this 5 years ago, is you're like, for gamers, this is as big of a deal as Spectre and Meltdown were to server people. So if you're a gamer and you're wondering what it was like to deal with Spectre and Meltdown, this is what it was like. It was chaos. You didn't trust them. Everything was costing you more money than you wanted. Intel seemed confused and like they didn't know what they were doing. And except with the added that it's actually kind of worse because they don't seem to have a way to really fix it.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, I think they do. They just would have to take the sort of performance hit they took in server.
And also illegal, they're going to have to pay a legal price as well, because it's basically false advertising.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to pay it for this, because you have to wonder if somebody knew about this specifically. But also, they just openly admitted on Reddit that they had an oxidation issue they didn't tell anyone about. And I'm like, oh my God, how you just admitted you lied to your, and that probably affected some Sapphire Rapids and Raptor Lake chips as well. And so they opened themselves up to more litigation in how they responded to this one. It's just crazy to me.
Fortunately, though, the server validation periods at companies are long enough so that when I looked at the time period that you described, I don't think that any of those oxidized Sapphire Rapids made it to production. I think they got caught in time.
Mm-hmm. It's possible, because when I asked some people about the failure rates of Sapphire Rapids, it didn't seem clear to me that there was a giant spike at a certain time, really. Or at least I can't be sure. Someone else could, though. I'm sure someone else has the data to prove that or not.
Yeah.
This piece of content is brought to you by the Minis Forum MSA1 Mini Workstation. The MSA1 comes with a 65-watt 8700G, although you can certainly choose a bare bones offering and put in a CPU of your choice, but it also then includes 3 screen outputs, 40 gigabit per second USB 4, and dual 2.5G RJ45 ports. And it even has an Oculink port, so you can add a discrete GPU eventually if you want to. And in all honesty, this thing just felt really high quality and has excellent serviceability. So if you're interested in this, use the offer code BrokenSilicon to save $30 off the Minis Forum MSA1. And remember that even just clicking on the links in the description helps the channel as well. So support this channel by checking out the Minis Forum MSA1 today. Compressed AI Blocks writes in and asks, how bad are the security issues arising in Zen compared to Skylake? I haven't paid any attention to it, but I have seen that some new security things popped up with Zen recently. He says, will we see similar performance regressions if they get patched?
Actually, earlier this month, we're dealing with a major one called sync close in Zen architecture. Actually, it's 18 years worth of AMD CPUs going from Zen 4 all the way back to 18 years ago. It's probably one of the biggest vulnerabilities in AMD. It's really bad in the sense that if someone gets access to the shell of your hardware, in this case, it's a hypervisor, and they can actually rootkit the machine, they can then embed the SMM, which is this, I think it's a security management. I have to go back and look that up, what the acronym stands for. But they can embed their own code into that chip, and once they get in there, it's almost impossible to get it out. You can, but it takes an enormous amount of work. It's almost cheaper just to rip and replace the chip. And so if you have a fleet of Epic servers and they got in, and then they infected all those CPUs, you've got potentially you could have an entire fleet of Epics that are worthless. And you have to replace them with new Epic chips. And it's probably one of the worst.
Is there a mitigation out yet, or a patch out yet?
They're coming out. I'm waiting on my OS distributor, but we're following up on that. So
when something like this happens, what do you do in the meantime? I mean, you're not going to air gap all these servers, right? I mean, you just hope you don't get hacked, or
no. We always create a layered defense, because these things are going to happen. And remember, and from my last podcast, I said to you that Intel has a lot of security vulnerabilities. AMD is going to have it. Well, this is AMD's moment. It was bound to happen sooner or later. And in fact, probably the last 18 months was probably rough on AMD. The worst one I've seen was Red Fleet. I've actually seen a 12% drop in performance on my Epic servers. It's actually significant that I've had to increase the core counts per VM to compensate for the slowdown. And if so far it's holding steady, but probably around next year, I'll probably have to increase the clock from 1500 to 1800 megahertz. The fortunate thing is that I'm running the server still under capacity. It's just such a large server. It's 64 cores. It's still under capacity, so I have room to expand. And then on top of that, I'm not even utilizing the full clock speed. The factory base clock is 2 gigahertz. I'm still running 25% below the factory clock, but I'm going to have to probably raise it up now. We're just seeing how it goes right now. It's just taking it slow. But if you think about it, with the Intel Xeons, we lost about, in my case, at least 43% in 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
AMD, I would say, probably lost 10 to 12, about 12%, 13% in 4 years. If I had to pick the lesser two evils, I would prefer the AMD, especially the fact that they have features that really help us a lot in the areas of security. So, yes, it's very bad. Let's not sugarcoat it.
Mm-hmm.
AMD has to respond. And by the way, AMD has to put out patches for Zen Plus and everything, all their Zen processes. They got to get patched.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot leave your customers hanging out like that to dry. That's very bad. And they need to be called out for that.
So just to put a bow on this here, I have to ask this question. Has any of the recent AMD vulnerabilities bothered you as much as the Intel ones did? And if not, or if yes, why? What's the reason it did or didn't bother you as much as the Intel one?
I'd say, honestly, both AMD and Intel, they both bother me equally.
Well, of course they do. Oh, equally. Okay.
Yeah, they both bother me. But you have to look at the consequences, and you got to know what is the risks. And let's say if AMD has a bunch of security vulnerabilities, and let's say you don't trust AMD, where are you going to go to? Going to go to Intel? Are they going to do a better job? Given recent history, the answer is no. So at that point, you're actually better off staying on AMD because it's the lesser two problems. So sometimes life has to forces you to take a path of least risk. And AMD is at this point, despite what's happened, and it's not good, it's still less riskier. And that's why it's incumbent upon us to design these systems and operate them in a way to mitigate the weaknesses that they will always have.
It kind of sounds like you're saying it's how the companies responded that is kind of the differentiator too. Am I wrong?
That too, yeah.
Because
another thing is that when you look at the security vulnerabilities, the blast radius generally has been smaller on AMD, even though this one's really, really large. For example, Red Bleed, which is really bad on Zen 2, is not impacted on Zen 3. And probably won't be impacted on Zen 4 and Zen 5. Which means that what I'm seeing is that AMD is constantly working to improve the security to the best of their abilities. Obviously, they'll never be perfect. It's impossible. But they're constantly trying to make improvements to the security, which means that they're doing their best to keep the blast radius as small as possible. But, invariably, you're going to get moments like these. These things are going to happen. Mm-hmm. But when you put in the mitigations, we don't see as much of a performance impact as what we've seen on Intel. And that's really due to how AMD holistically designs its architecture as opposed to Intel. And you can definitely tell Intel, and that's probably a impact to the fiefdom within the company. You see kind of the designs kind of hodgepodge together. And that's why you have these. And they almost take a lot of shortcuts. And that's a result of a fragmented design.
Like one group's doing this, one group's doing that.
Yeah,
they don't communicate
and they kind of
enough and they put it together.
Whereas AMD kind of is definitely you can definitely tell they're doing a little more holistically, which is today is actually more important than just having sheer quantity. Which 15 years ago, it was to get in performance, it's about getting the best process node, not so much the best design. But because of laws of physics and the law of diminishing returns, you're going to get the ability to solve problems elegantly and cleverly is going to become more important. That's where the power has shifted from Intel to AMD. It's really that.
Yeah, I mean, I continue. Well, we've already talked about it, right? I continue to think the major issue Intel has here is they just don't communicate between different parts of their company, and they're just trying to do too much, and they just don't seem to have their eye on the ball as much anymore. And you can say, oh, they messed this up, they messed that up, but ultimately it's all coming from the cultural problem, really. It's not like a silver bullet or golden bullet here causing the issues.
This requires leadership, good leadership, and Intel sadly has not been served by good leadership. And that's why th're in the straight they're in. And that's when I saw that again during Spectre meltdown 2018, 19, when we saw what was how Intel responded, and just uh, the fact that it was a design problem that's born out of a cultural the culture. Once you understand that, you know that the changing that can take a decade or more, and that's what really is a huge impetus to actually take the chance and just switch over to AMD, even though it took me 5.5 years to get everything certified and validated and checked out and everything.
Mm-hmm.
It took that long. It's done now. It's completed. It's everything certified. Everything's working fine. Everything's great. So I have no inclination going back. There's nothing to go back to. Even if they have something actually really good and actually they're starting doing better, as long as AMD doesn't mess up and keep doing its job.
As long as the performance is even remotely similar, it's not really a concern.
No, and as long as that we can we get what we can do what we got to do and continue to have a good profit margin, then there's not as much of a strong incentive to switch, because it just takes a lot of time, and time's money.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to that cultural issue, I mean, again, same thing for Raptor Lake. I mean, really, you have this, what I think is a ring bus design flaw. There's some concerns about oxidation. And from what I've heard as well, they just rushed validation for the consumer parts way too fast. They rushed the design process, kind of just copying and pasting some things.
I think the whole industry has done that too.
Well, think if you just copy and paste parts of Alder Lake into Raptor Lake and double the cores, but then increase voltage. Well, you need to validate that this design you have works. It's like taking a car and putting in a V12 engine and 8 wheels and going, I'm sure the chassis will be fine. It might not be. That's the same thing as you're describing. It's the cultural issue is what drove them to make that mistake.
Yeah, I think also I've noticed that the other companies, AMD, Nvidia, also at times rush things too.
Yeah.
And I think but those same three companies don't really do that in our space. If they try to rush, we're going to catch on to it really quickly, and we're going to call them out on that very quickly. And we take our time in terms of validation. I mean, there's a reason why we do that. This is precisely what we're seeing in Raptor Lake is precisely why we take our time. We test everything. The behavior of the industry is a reflection of its customer base. And I think we got to take a hard look at the customer base and what they prioritize and what
how much maybe we're demanding new things when maybe you should let them slow down and make sure it works.
Yes. I think that they were talking about 1.5 year cadence. I think that's just too fast. I think 3 year cadence.
They are. Both Nvidia and AMD are for AI. Yeah.
I think having a 3 year cadence is probably more appropriate. And that you shouldn't just upgrade to the next version. You should do every other versions. If you're doing upgrades.
Let me ask you this. So Compressed AI Blocks writes, and it says, Zen 5 for client has been a mixed bag, with desktop being the weakest in terms of reviews so far. How do you think this affects server customers? Will they just ignore these issues as their environments are radically different? Are they going to stick with Zen 3 and Zen 4 and not look at Zen 5? Or do you think Zen 5 desktop reviews being lukewarm to bad won't have any effect on what people do with server at all?
Zero. Complete zero. We don't pay attention. We don't even pay attention to even enterprise reviews. We will test them ourselves. We will not, because they cannot know exactly how we run our environments. Even the reviewers cannot possibly know. So the only way to get the real truth is we actually have to test them ourselves. It's the only way to get the real truth. And honestly, a lot of these reviews, they're not even relevant to us. So, and the problem is that you guys are going after those day one reviews. We don't care about day one reviews. We would wait at least 3 months before we even think about a review.
And then after you've had more time, maybe even newer patches come out, you can look at it.
I never considered, in terms of new products that come out, I never buy products before 4 months. Never.
I am kind of the same way as well. Like, I guess they've had exceptions.
Like sweet spot.
But especially when it comes to a new platform, like when Zen 4 came out, I wasn't looking to upgrade anyways. But were I to look to upgrade, I'm going to give that motherboard in that platform, 4 months of being on the market to see how it's doing,
Yes.
if it needs any BIOS updates, if there's something I should know.
New platform, I usually wait towards more the end of the generation before I would go to it. And that's because
End of the
everything's
platform generation.
Yeah. Like the DDR5, that's why I target 2026 if I'm going to DDR5. And that may not be if the Zen 6 is not nearly as financially competitive as the Zen 3. I might end up still going to remain on DDR4.
Let me ask this question. The best RT taken, or the best road, but he makes it click ray tracing taken, asks, do you think that Microsoft knew of how bad the Intel failures were and how badly Zen 5 was performing behind the scenes, and then that's why they became so hyped about using ARM in laptops? And do you think x86 processor launches require a lot more tweaks on Windows and should maybe be, I don't know, not rushed as much? I guess you probably answered that part already.
No, I don't think it has anything to do with it. Just take it as it is, Don't think that just because this happened, you think that's what they are doing. That's kind of like,
I agree.
I see it as more as wishful thinking.
No, I think what's going on with Microsoft is they're just tired of being stuck with Intel in their laptops. And they know that if they switch to AMD, they don't want to be stuck with AMD. It has nothing to do with what's going on right now with their CPUs in terms of literally the performance or reliability of Raptor Lake or Zen 5. I think Microsoft just really wants another option, and they're going to make sure they get it. And that's why they're pushing Qualcomm so hard.
I'm not considering any ARM laptop, so I don't really care.
Well, I mean, let me see. That's kind of what I want to start talking about next. I mean, Compressed AI Blocks writes in and says, do you think we'll be seeing RISC-V or ARM-based server products from Intel or AMD in the near future? And I'm also just curious what you think about x86 versus ARM and RISC-V as well.
RISC-V? No. Intel will always be on x86. They're not going to do RISC-V or ARM.
I tend to agree, not necessarily because I think that's smart, but just because I hear nothing about them looking at ARM. I hear zero.
I don't think they're culturally capable at this point,
right?
Given their circumstances. AMD, the closest I can think is maybe ARM, but because they have an ARM license, but we haven't seen anything coming out of them. Most applications are x86 based. If you're doing ARM based, it's usually open source on microservices. And the problem is that right now ARMs are mostly deployed within walled gardens like AWS, Google, Microsoft. Maybe Microsoft, I don't know, but it's not really a prevalent platform unless you want to be stuck in a walled garden. At this point, I just don't see it. You would have to rewrite a lot of the application. 90% of the application is still x86. You're going to have to rewrite all that. Just not going to happen. And then on top of that, you can't say that it's efficiency because you can make x86 as efficient as ARM without having to do a complete rewrite of your applications.
Which I think we've seen with Strix. I mean, there's some debate about if it is or it isn't. There are some things, Qualcomm's X Elite chip is more efficient at doing, but in plenty of other workloads, AMD Strix processor is just as efficient.
Yeah, and I also disagree with Wendell as well.
On what?
On the ARM parts, like he's saying that a lot of companies are looking at ARM. I don't see that. Most enterprises I know, they like to keep things steady and stable.
Do you think it could be more of the growing markets though, like maybe AI and newer types of data centers, like not legacy or existing? Like they're probably considering ARM more.
Yeah, but they're not going to be 90% of the market even in 20 years. They could be maybe 10-15%. in 20 years. But they're going to be mostly niche. They can definitely be in the AI spot, especially if you're just simply consuming the AI through an API. You run an API request and you get a response. At that point, it becomes the OS, the hardware is just completely abstracted away from your applications. That's really the only areas where I can see ARM is. It's just avoiding having to have to buy an x86 processor from the outside. So say a company like Nvidia, they want to have a self-contained unit. They already have the DGX1 and 2s. I suspect maybe their next, they'll have a future version where they'll have everything self-contained, vertically integrated, and then you just consume their product through an AI, maybe through their subscription services, something like that. But
Hmm.
given how that company is going culturally, thinks, I think that's a more likely situation. I just don't see at this point that the mainstream market is going to use the ARM processor.
Now, I did have a leak about something called Soundwave, which is an AMD APU that supposedly will use ARM cores in like 2 or 3 years from now. Personally, I think this is them testing the waters on an ARM chip, seeing if they can prove they can do ARM better than anyone else. Also, just having another option, it might be worth it, I think, for them to get some experience making ARM products when you consider that, like, they wanted to make the Nintendo Switch 2. Apparently, Nvidia outbid them. Nintendo Switch 2 uses ARM. It might just make sense to have some off the shelf ARM variant they work on just for the customers that insist on using it. But that's only in laptop. I haven't heard of AMD doing any ARM servers. I'm wondering what you think about that, though, like AMD, because I'm hearing they're working on like an APU for a laptop. I haven't heard anything about server, though.
I'm not familiar with that APU. Again, I'm
Sure.
it's I haven't really I haven't really been in touch with the tech world because of work. It's only recently that with the Raptor blow up and then the recent Zen issue, that's when I start coming back. That it's basically it remind me that CPU is it's got x86 and ARM in it, or is it just one or the other?
I believe it is just ARM. I guess I don't know for sure at this stage, but I believe it's just ARM.
I guess I don't know.
Yeah, but that's different than server, where you seem pretty confident they're not going to bother with that anytime soon.
I at this point, the market I don't think is there yet,
Mm-hmm.
and it may be possible, it may never be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've read online, with the Qualcomm laptops that sales have been not the complete worst, but pretty bad. And that now some vendors are saying they're having like 50% return rates because people are using the laptop. And then in a month, they find out that like half their apps don't work, or an app they wanted to download doesn't work, or a game won't run, and that they're just returning them. And we're going to have to see. Qualcomm's I think ARM on Windows has a future potentially, but the next 6 months are really going to be critical for both Microsoft, who wants ARM as an option on Windows, and Qualcomm to really make sure they nail their software better and get their prices lower. Because the way I'm seeing this going, I mean, what happens if in like it just came out like a month or two ago, and there's a lot of people that will have return windows, and if they just all start being sent back to Amazon, I mean, the damage might be done then to the perception.
If they want to learn about how to do hardware architecture transition, they should learn from Apple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was a huge undertaking that they didn't.
3 of them.
Mm-hmm.
From Motorola 6800 to PowerPC, and PowerPC to Intel, and Intel to ARM. So they're the masters at hardware architecture transitions.
Let me pivot to this subject. Ming3825 writes and says, "Hey, Tom and guest, what is the non-NVIDIA GPU or NPU adoption rate in server? Is CUDA an NVIDIA moat that's unbeatable?"
Nothing will ever be unbeatable. It's just, is it beatable within a short period of time? The answer is no. The whole industry is coalescing around NVIDIA and their CUDA on top of AMD CPUs. The reason is because the talent pool is there for CUDA. Most of the people have already been trained on that skill set. They're pretty much approaching middle age. It's kind of hard for them to kind of learn a new language at that point in time.
I see. Yeah.
And I remember I talked to you about that in the previous podcast. NVIDIA, to their credit, recognized this market and built an entire ecosystem by themselves without anyone's help, because there was no one there to get help on. So they had to build it all themselves. So they built not only the ecosystem, but then also build the critical mass of talent pool to maximize the ecosystem's benefits. And so you essentially have an entire generation of people with that talent. And that talent is still going to be there for the next 15, 20 years. And so it's effectively unbeatable in that period of time. What's going to cause their erosion over decades is that those people are going to have to retire. And if Intel, and this is probably Intel's greatest Achilles heel, is by keeping the cost of their hardware so high, will prevent the next generation of talent to be able to learn the CUDA ecosystem. And if that the younger generation don't have access to it, they're going to learn something else. And that something else is going to ultimately, in time, just by the passage of time, people retiring, people sadly having to pass away, is going to end up replacing you unless you don't make the ecosystem accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things NVIDIA is doing is they're trying to build courses to get people to learn their stuff in the school context.
Yeah,
but
they're huge in college.
Yeah, the truth is that the best way to learn is basically kids getting the stuff and learning on their own at home. That's how I learn a lot of my stuff. But if you don't have access to the ecosystem because you're a teenager, you're not going to spend the time to learn it, and that's going to be the Achilles heel of NVIDIA in the decades to come. They're not going to lose 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. They're not going to. They're not going to lose. Where they can lose is 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. Also, you have to consider the CEO, who's really brilliant. He's not going to be there forever. 30 years from now, I mean, how old is he? How old is he going to be in 30 years?
He looks good for his age at the moment. Yeah, he's 61.
Yeah, he's going to be 90. So it's very doubtful he's going to be at NVIDIA forever. The amount of energy it takes to run that company is enormous. It's going to take a toll on his health. So he's not going to be there forever. So the critical point is basically when the CEO has to find his successor. And not all successions work out. I mean, we all know what happened with Steve Jobs and Scully. That famous incident.
But Tim's turned out a great CEO for Apple. So they did find one.
Yes. In that case, that
Tim
was
Cook,
successful.
yeah.
Yes, Tim Cook, yes. But that's really going to be their Achilles heels, is basically getting the next generation of talent onto their ecosystem. And
that's probably why it's so important for them to not lose a lot of gaming market share ever, because I know a lot of developers that use both, or should I say aspiring developers that use AMD or Nvidia gaming GPUs. And the fact that AMD has these cheaper graphics cards with 16 gigabytes of RAM. I know a lot of people in college that will go and buy, a 7800 XT for $450 or something. And then it's like, hey, I got a 16 gigabyte GPU. I can run AI on it. And of course, NVIDIA also has a 4060 Ti for a similar price, but it's a lot weaker. NVIDIA I would advise they not get too greedy with graphics cards, because the next generation is learning how to make these models and apps on these gaming cards. And if they all became AMD at a certain point, that might remove how many people insist on using NVIDIA when they get real jobs.
Yes. And that's actually, and the reason I say that is I've seen this movie before. I've been in that movie before, between Microsoft and the open source world in Linux. Microsoft had a monopoly, really strong monopoly back in the late 90s into 2000s. Okay. And then you have Linux and open source, which is really a response to the absolute gouging of Microsoft to their customers. In this case, the enterprise customers. And I was definitely one of those people that helped bring Linux into the enterprise space. But ultimately, what allows Linux to ultimately win out wasn't the fact that Linux was superior, which it was. It still took 20 years to win out. And the reason it took 20 years is because the people who work in these companies were only Microsoft. They only had Microsoft knowledge only.
Yep.
And they cannot change from Microsoft to Linux because their learning window has already closed. It's hard for them to learn. They're in their 40s, 50s. It's hard for them to relearn. I'm seeing this myself.
Yeah.
When you get to a certain age, your learning ability starts to slow down. When you get older, it takes longer to learn a new skill.
Yeah.
And
Sure, it
then,
does.
and then on top of that, you have less time to get the benefit out of it. So your return on investment gets shorter and shorter. So and then on top of that, at some point you're going to retire. And so the question is, are you willing to learn this new skill that you're not going to use in retirement?
Yeah, when it comes to the gaming market side, I will say that people shouldn't be surprised if I have some pretty big updates on RDNA 4 and the generation AMD is coming out this year for gamers over the next couple of weeks, because I do have some new information I'm receiving here, and it does sound exciting. I think this really could be a game changer with the memory capacity and the performance you get for the price. But I think we're going to have to see if AMD nails it, because I feel like they really botched the Zen 5 launch. I think the Strix launch could have been better. And it'll be interesting to see if AMD realizes the opportunity they have right now with how much NVIDIA has been price gouging and kind of alienating gamers, and that if they realize they can win the next generation.
Like I said, it's still going to take at least a decade.
Yeah. It would, because they're going to have to buy these cards, and then AMD is going to have to do a good job for a decade straight, and then they're going to have to graduate. For now, NVIDIA just has this market, but you can see a situation.
They're going to own this market for the next generation. And for us in the enterprise space, when we say generation, we don't talk about product generation or refresh.
No, I know.
We talk about human generation, 20 years, 20, 25 years.
But you think AMD can maintain their market share at a certain point there, with what they're doing, though? So at least it's a slow climb until there's that tipping point. Or do you think it's just going to be complete dominance and they just have to lay the groundwork with very little to show for it for that decade?
It's going to be more like the latter. However, I don't think they're going to make much on the gaming side, but in the enterprise side, they're getting a lot of help from the company, from the businesses. Yes, they're buying Nvidia, but here's the thing: they don't want entire industries be dependent on one company. It's such a dangerous situation, political situation. So a lot of these companies, they're investing in AMD just to protect themselves from a single source supplier, because we all went through this. The whole industry after industry went through this with Microsoft 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen this movie before, and now people from my generation, we're in position of leadership, decision making. We're now the senior people. We knew what it was like back in the Microsoft monopoly. So we are not going to put the companies that we work for at risk of a single vendor source.
Mm-hmm.
We're just not going to do that.
And again, I think that's why you've seen this big push with like Qualcomm and ARM, is they see AMD overtaking Intel and laptop, and they're going, we better make sure there's another option still, because we do not want AMD to become Intel. We need options. Yeah,
this is the big difference between the consumers and the enterprise or in the company and the corporate world, is that we do look at single source risks, supply chain risk. The consumers, from what I can tell, they do not. They just want, especially your audience, they want like the fastest, and they don't care. And
more of them are professionals than you might think, actually. Okay. But yes, probably most are gamers. Now that it's warming up outside, Jesse couldn't be happier to be jumping around every day in the warmer weather. And it's good for me too. Running around with her, teaching her tricks, that's good for my health as well, not just hers. But all of this gallivanting, well, it takes up time and it pressures me to make my lunches quicker to get moving faster with Jesse every weekend afternoon. And usually quick means less healthy. Well, unless you know about Vite Ramen. This piece of content is brought to you by Vite Ramen. Vite Ramen is a healthy, tasty, and shelf-stable food crafted by an American startup that offers a ton of options for eating healthy, like their classic packages that make it easy to add protein and other ingredients of your choice, and then also their Ramen Go packages that offer a healthy microwavable option for those who truly only have a 15-minute lunch break away from home. And I do need to take a second also to remind everyone that they don't just make ramen. They also have Nano Boost Vitality Powder that I honestly think blows away the health powder competition. I literally drink this any night a Broken Silicon is recorded extra late instead of coffee. And they also have a collection of silverware and accessories that are always high quality. Like the Goofy Girl DM Nakiri knife, I tried it out. It is insanely sharp. It is probably the nicest knife this household owns. So not just the ramen, although the ramen's great. Everything else on there is high quality, and that's why I've been working with Fight Ramen for so long. I actually like their products, all of their products, a lot. I've never tried something they made that wasn't good, so check them out. And remember that even just clicking on the link in the description helps the channel a ton, and buying some of the special packs through that link helps you save money and support the channel even more. So support Moore's Law Zed by checking out Fight Ramen today. But this is kind of a random thing to bring up, but it kind of ties into this idea of AMD trying to play for a market in a different way. From what I've seen with like Strix Halo, Medusa Halo, all of these like APUs they're working on that aren't just like, good enough to use the graphics, but they're like putting in full PS5 or better power, like mid-range graphics cards built into the CPU. Those are coming out early next year. The sense that I'm getting is that AMD realizes that it's almost impossible to take the laptop graphics market because Nvidia is just so entrenched. But if they can offer OEMs like HP or Lenovo an APU that has a graphics card that's so good, not only do you not need a GPU, you might not be able to fit it in the laptop anymore, then that's a way to kind of force them to buy their graphics cards. I wonder how you think about that strategy of like AMD realizing the way to get graphics card sales is to attach them to the CPU. So it's more efficient too. So there are benefits to them doing that. But like doing this so that when they buy an AMD CPU, they already bought an AMD GPU. And it's kind of similar in server and AI. When you look at MI300X and some of these products that put the GPU on it, they're like, yeah, don't buy an Nvidia GPU. You don't need to. Buy this. It's better. And now we've kind of force you to buy GPU with the CPU. I wonder what you think about that strategy and how that could be a vector into AMD taking kind of de facto GPU market share in AI and server.
For the MI300, I think people who are buying it are doing it on purpose. I don't think they're being forced to.
No, not forced, but you see what I'm saying. It's like, we did it. We sold them a GPU because it is also a GPU.
It's very similar to basically Microsoft bundling IE in Windows 98 or 95.
Yeah, except MI300X is actually good. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, but it's similar. It's bundling. Companies do that all the time.
So how do you think that could affect their ability to maybe compete with Nvidia a little more in data center though, through that method of the whole thing is one chip?
It can. Power efficiency is going to be an issue. It's going to be a thing. If they can get, if you can get MI300s and basically have multiple sockets in one U, then you could probably stuff more compute horsepower in a smaller space. But I haven't really looked into those types of machines. I'm not really in the AI side of it. Just to let you know.
Well, perfect, because CoLaddict has that question. Do you see a push for AI from management at your job? And how do you respond to it? Do they even have a plan for what to do with it and they can sell? Do they even have a plan they think they can sell? Sorry, I botched the wording.
At this point, no.
So no one's pushing AI with you much at all right now?
Nope. I don't expect them to even do it, given the nature of that company's business.
Well, KJM015 writes in and says, hello, Tom and guest. As a consumer, it's starting to seem like a lot of the hype and buzz around AI and machine learning is starting to die down a bit. Is the wave of investment towards AI and data centers slowing down at all? So maybe you don't, but maybe people you could give us an idea. Are data centers still buying up workstation GPUs by the pallet, or has machine learning hardware purchasing leveled off?
I'm not really into the workstation space, so I can't really say. But they're still buying data center GPUs. I mean, just look at the quarter filings, But eventually, that's going to end because it is a bubble, and at some point, you got to tell these investors, show me the money.
Yeah, they're starting to ask that a lot right now. I've noticed.
Show me the money. How are you going to make money off of this investment?
Yeah, I mean, what do you think about the AI bubble? I have to ask. You must have an opinion.
It's dumb. It's like the .com bubble. It's going to crash. And, sure, there's going to be applications for it, but right now...
Sure, we still use Google, even though the .com bubble happened.
Yeah. I'm sure there's going to be applications, but it's got to be done on a rational basis. You got to know what is the cost, what is the benefit. Is there a benefit? and what's the cost to acquire that benefit, and is that benefit high enough to justify that cost that you can make money on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that market is going to be a lot smaller than what people are imagining right now. Right now, people are just have this kind of dollar signs in their eyes, and tech people have this starry eyes, like, oh, new stuff, like, yeah, okay. Most of what we do is just keep the world running and keep it running at as low cost as possible. That's kind of like most of the world.
It's funny, on a podcast, I heard someone bring up the point that the reason big tech loves AI so much right now is that it advantages asymmetrically the bigger company. They think it does, at least. We'll see if it pans out, because the bigger you are, the more money you have, the more graphics cards you can buy to try to build a better model. Like, I think people don't realize a lot of times with like these mega companies like Amazon, when they try to get into a new business or make a new market, in a boardroom, they might say something like, what's the startup cost? And it's like massive. The CEO might go, good. Because if the startup cost for this type of venture is massive, no one else can afford to compete with us if you're Amazon. And I think that's why they're buying into AI so much, is they realize there's only 5 companies that have the money, at least based on how they think AI will turn out. You need a lot of money to do a lot of training. I think that's why they're going so crazy after it, is because they see it as an arms race, and an arms race that advantages major mega companies. And so we got to do this because this is a thing we can easily win. But I mean, I don't know. We're going to have to see if half, and I think it will be at least half of the things they think they're going to use AI for, really won't be ready for 20 years.
Yeah. And then on top of that, we don't know what the social implications will be.
Mm-hmm.
It takes about 20 years to actually see the consequences of a new technology. That's usually how long it takes.
Well, and I think the most important word in that sentence you said too was "don't know," or I guess that's 2 words, because it's so funny. 10 years ago they were going, all you coal miners got to learn to code. They didn't. They still have a lot of they can still get another working class job, whereas the people who are coding are the ones being replaced by AI. So we don't know. We don't really know who's going to get hurt and who's going to benefit. But I have a strong suspicion a lot of the people we think will be hurt, they're not. I mean, when you look at AI, we've been told we're going to have all self-driving in 5 years for 10 years straight, and we're just no. I don't actually see it for 10 years now. Maybe ever, or
no.
To certain degrees, in areas and localized places, it will work. But everything
in a controlled environment, it can work. But the problem is that ultimately AI cannot compete with a human in terms of solving problems creatively, creatively, quickly. That's the inherent advantage a human has over any kind of AI, no matter how powerful that thing is.
Yeah.
And then you got to think about the energy cost as well.
Yeah. All these people were so worried about Bitcoin mining. Now all of a sudden they don't seem to care about energy.
Well, it's going to impact the AI as well.
That's what I'm saying. Is it's just funny that all of a sudden they're not concerned about it. They all were a few years ago. It tells you, it was just a talking point.
They are. It's power usage is the number one concern for data centers across the world.
Actually, here's a question. So let's say the AI bubble pops in a bad way. I hope, that we've already seen some tech companies drop a lot in price. They've mostly recovered already by now. But we could hopefully just see this trunicated. Like the .com bubble really wasn't that bad. It was just one sector that crashed, rebounded over time, didn't drag everyone else down right away. Hopefully something like that can happen with AI that's more controlled. Like, hopefully, I hope the AI bubble crashes sooner rather than later, so it's not as much of a drop, right? Let's come to terms with it now. But let's say it doesn't crash for a year. Probably won't. And then when it does, it is this giant 90% drop. What do you think that's going to do to like the GPUs and the AI cards they buy out? Because I know there's going to be some companies. Some companies will be smart. They'll be fine. They bought the right amount. But there's going to be a lot of them that I think that bought 2, 3, 4, 10 times as many products as they needed, and those are just going to flood eBay. And what do you think that's going to do? Like, would your company buy them up on the cheap on eBay? I know some companies do that when these crashes happen.
Sometimes they do. Right now, we don't have a use case for it, so why bother?
Right, but maybe even some CPUs could go on the market that were powering those, workstations and racks.
I just wouldn't buy secondhand Epics
Hmm.
because unless we have assurances that the patches have been applied, unless we have assurances that they're not impacted by sync close. So, and also the other problem is that they also have fuses that locks them to the OEM machines. So,
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
yeah, we need to. Yeah, if you're going to get secondhand AMD, you gotta have to do you gotta figure out the history of that processor. Which hands it went through. So you have to do a kind of little due diligence on that. It's actually much easier to get Intel CPUs, Intel server chips secondhand. They're a lot cheaper because they depreciate a lot faster than AMD. And then on top of that, you have to do more work in validating the AMD. So I'm probably going to stay away from the secondhand AMD. I'm just going to get brand new ones, even if they cost more. It's just I have more assurances of where we're going through the supply chain.
Yeah, but it's funny. I remember a decade ago, one of the best deals you could get if you were building a desktop was either engineering samples or secondhand like Broadwell or Haswell server chips. Like my friend got a 10-core Broadwell chip for $240 10 years ago, which at the time, everybody, there were not 16 cores on desktop. This person got a 10-core for the price of an i5. And I wonder if we'll see that again if this bubble pops, where one of the best deals you can get is just secondhand Sapphire Rapids 24-core on eBay, for a cheap price. It'll be I'd imagine the floor is going to be higher than it was in the past because it is a lot more expensive to make than what those were back then. But I think for consumers, it might be
dollars floating around too. A lot more currency floating around.
Yeah. So, but it will be interesting to see like people who are considering building like a $10,000, $5,000 Threadripper system. They look on eBay and they see like a $500, $1,000 Sapphire Rapids, and they're like, "Oh, I just saved myself $3,000."
If these companies go out of business, they get the stuff gets dumped. It's not unlike what happened after .com bubble, where all that stuff was dumped on the market. Like Cisco gear got dumped on the market.
Yes, yeah.
So they had to write up a lot of losses because companies like Cisco and Dell and Intel were all basically vendor financing. They had to write off all that losses.
Chris Rich writes in, and he says, looking ahead to the next 5 years in general servers, do you see any major developments that aren't just more of the same? AI is currently driving a lot of R&D, and could some of this spill over into general servers, for example, high-speed memory or higher-end interconnects and networking?
Definitely the interconnects, definitely memory, capacity memory. Right now, we're kind of constrained by memory capacity and memory density. I think a lot more innovation are going to come on the memory side and the I/O side. One thing I actually had to do in my data center is I have to upgrade my network switches in about 2 years' time. And the reason is because when we start going to Epic, the performance of those servers were so high that it actually can push the older switches. So we're going to basically bring them up to, we're going to get switches that can go up to 100 gigs. Right now, they're 1 gig and 10 gig switches. And they got pushed. On Intel, we never see them get pushed that hard. So that's another thing is the performance we get on AMD on the I/O side. That's another advantage that we see on the AMD side.
Ming3825 writes in and says, hi, Tom and guest. What are your opinions on the VMware exodus and the replacements? And what are your thoughts on cloud versus on-premise in 2024? I like this question because this is something I've been consistently hearing from people I talk to in server and at just mid-sized companies especially, is not everything's going to the cloud anymore, and people are tired of it.
I still am a big fan of on-prem, and that's because of data sovereignty. The other factor is that when you rent, you're going to pay a lot more for renting than it is for owning your own hardware. The only reason that companies actually will want to rent is because you can spin up an application and service very quickly. You could just get developers. You don't need to get an infrastructure guy or a systems guy to actually build and manage the infrastructure. You can rent them out, but long term, you're going to always pay for it. And this is the problem with the cloud: is if all your automation process is built on that cloud vendor platform, you're kind of stuck on that. You're basically giving away however many percentage of your profitability to that cloud vendor by using their services. And you don't have control over that tax effectively. And so to lower that tax, the cloud tax, you want to own your own hardware. Also, there's regulatory requirements that you need to keep data on premise. The industries I work in kind of have to do that. You can't easily put stuff to the cloud. That's why I've been very loath to do that too. It's because of that security and privacy issues. As far as the VMware, that's a big issue. They got bought out by Broadcom, and they're changing their licensing from a perpetual license to a subscription base. Effectively, they're trying to become a government and a taxing authority. And that's really hitting what we call the mid-markets, the mid-range companies. Basically, companies get 16 cores, 24 cores, maybe 32 cores. They won't get 64 cores. But generally, like 16 to 32 cores, that's kind of like, and the sweet spot's 24 cores. They're going to end up paying so much more in VMware licensing fees. And a lot of companies are not happy about that. Now, in the larger companies where, especially financials, the VMware is kind of like the standard. And so for them to move, it's going to be almost impossible for them to do that. But for the mid-range, if Broadcom were to charge too much, if these companies can get someone who can know another type of hypervisor, which is the most popular one is KVM-Q EMU, okay, and a very popular product called Proxmox. I think Windows also talked about it. We also worked on it too. Is becoming very popular. You could get some of these companies to start moving over because they don't want to pay that tax. But the caveat is that moving between VMware to another hypervisor is not the easiest thing to do. They're not like the lift and shift type of apps. You actually have to convert disks and make sure that everything works. And even if you get everything to work, you got to make sure the application is going to work right on that new hypervisor. They should, but again, in servers, we never really know until we actually test them and validate them. Everything has to be validated.
Bfish writes in, says, generally, product evolutions for enterprise have trickled down into consumer markets over time. However, recently we're starting to see enterprise and data center products, even the lower end stuff, be so far ahead of what consumers would need. Do you think the AI bubble bursting might reverse this trend and push things to be more consumer centric in their design? Or do you think this gap is just going to keep widening?
Eventually, it's going to cost so much that it's not even worth it for even enterprise customers to get the latest.
Right. I think that's what we're seeing. So do you think this gap's going to keep widening between the top and the bottom? Or do you think at some point there's going to be more of a...
You could see a bifurcation. Like the hyperscalers and the HPCs, they can keep going, but then the general purpose enterprise will kind of lag behind. And in fact, the enterprise world is getting knocked down a few pegs behind the hyperscalers, especially when it comes to access to hardware. I remember during the midst of the Spectre meltdown, one of the challenges, especially during the pandemic, is getting new hardware, because the hyperscalers were getting the hardware first. So the enterprises, even big mega financial institutions, are getting shafted by the vendors. Even the OEMs are getting shafted by the vendors. AMD, Intel, Nvidia, and all those companies, because they're basically sending all their hardware to the hyperscalers. So we're seeing that we in the enterprise space are going to get knocked down a peg or two.
Yeah, and again, this just kind of randomly makes me think again about like what AMD needs to focus on, because they went, from 32 cores to 64 cores, then to 64 again, but then to 96 cores, 128 cores, 192
That's really for
cores.
The hyperscalers and the HPC. Where they've got the resources to buy that, and they can benefit from the super high density. For HPC, a lot of those are purchased by governments.
What percent of the market, though, do you think is going to want 256 cores instead of 192?
It's generally going to be the top 10.
I know it's not perfect, or you don't know for sure an exact number, but do you think it's like 10, 20% of people want that of the sales?
It's good. I would characterize as the types of customers rather than percentage.
No, but that's what I'm saying. Because if we get to a point where, is there any point in AMD going to 384 cores, 512 cores, if 90% of the market really just wish the cores below 128 were more efficient and faster? Like, at what point do you slow down a little bit in core count increases? Because it's becoming more and more niche that you want core counts in the hundreds.
That's basically you do a cost benefit analysis. It comes down to numbers, how profitable it is.
Yeah.
What's the cost of development? How much revenue are they going to get? What's the profitability of it, both from the customer side as well as from the vendor side?
Mm-hmm. Because you almost wonder if, like, at a certain point, I feel like I'm almost hearing this with some variants of Zen 6 I've heard about, that like AMD might be taking a focus here, a bifurcated focus where, yes, one side's stronger, but they're actually making a very, what's the word? Deliberate choice to make some of the Zen 6 stuff not as high core count and expensive as it could be, because they know that they still need to service this most of the market that doesn't need 256 cores for $20,000 a CPU.
And that's the biggest difference between AMD and Intel's, that they're listening to the market. Okay, the Zen 3 epics, they're still producing. That's because people like us, we're getting a little upset with Zen 4. It's going to cost us extra 30 to 50% more in terms of the life cycle of that machine. For what? So by having the extended lifespan of Zen 3, we at least have an option that will fit our economic models.
Mm-hmm.
And that shows that AMD is listening to its customers. Like the Epic 4000 series, that's really awesome. Although I wouldn't be using it in the data center because it doesn't have the SEV, SME. But like for home labs and small and medium businesses, like the 24 core count, that's going to be a boon to those mid-market companies, the medium-sized companies that run VMware. 16 core, 192 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of RAM, can run their basic applications. That's going to be great. Again, the only problem with the 4000 series is just it's just high memory support. They only go up to 192 gigs of RAM. Really, for entry-level servers, you're starting at 256. Mid-market is probably going to be a half a terabyte. And then when you start getting to the data center class servers, their minimum now is about a terabyte.
Well, that was going to be my next question after hearing you just say that. Like, there's Zen 5 cores, Zen 5C cores. From what I've heard, if AMD really wanted to, they could fit Zen 5C chiplets. Those are the chiplets that, of course, are denser cores, but twice as many cores. They could maybe fit 2 of those on an AM5 chip if they move some things around and like really tried to squeeze it in there. Is that a product that you think would make sense in the Epic 4000 series, a 32 Zen 5C core product on AM5? Or do you think the lack of memory would make that kind of pointless?
It's going to be a little more difficult because of the memory support.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're going to have the cores, but if you don't have the memory support, then you're going to have cores that are just going to idle there.
Yeah.
And that's also why the next refresh, I will not consider any CPUs above 64 core. It's because of the memory.
Unless they have far higher memory support, right?
Or the memory is lower costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I guess final question here. Valko Malev writes in, with the new lithography technologies, 2 nanometer, 3 nanometer, for how long do you think CPUs and GPUs will run on them? Will they have huge longevity, like of 20 or 30 years, or a shorter one of 5 to 6 years? What is the current longevity of the current server-grade CPUs and GPUs? And what about mixed products like Threadripper? And this is a concern I've heard, is that people are concerned with like how pushed to the limit in terms of physics the latest nodes are going to be, like 2 nanometer, that maybe they're going to degrade faster unless you clock them very low. But I'm wondering if you have a concern about that, and also just what you expect out of the longevity of a server product, and if that is changing over time.
I have no evidence that they're degrading. I think the Raptor Lake situation, what's so shocking about that is that for the first time we actually see a CPU chip actually degrading. I don't recall any chip in the last 30, 40 years has ever done anything like that. I mean, even Intel's Pentium 4s, AMD's Bulldozer,
both still running strong.
Both dumpster fires of architectures. they
But they
still
worked.
run. Yeah, they
Yeah.
still work. You can still use them. CPUs 30 years ago, they still work. I expect them. The expectations they should work for at least 30 years.
In the server space, at least.
In any space, in any CPU, that's an expectation. The mandatory requirement in servers is they got to last 10 years at minimum. Generally, what tends to fail I've seen is motherboards and memory. That's usually what I've seen fail. So what I do is that every 5 years, what I do to keep the servers running for 10 years is I basically replace the memory after 5 years. So I usually do a mid-cycle maintenance refresh to keep the machines working and to keep them running. And then remember, when you're buying a memory 5 years later for DDR4, it's going to be a lot cheaper. So that's why I'm so excited about the when AMD extended Zen 3 Epic Milan. I was really, really happy because I was not so sure how I was going to have to do a refresh in the 2025, 2026 timeframe with Zen 4, and then the power usage of these CPUs just going up and up. So I was concerned about the ability to do a proper refresh. So yeah, definitely. Despite the sinkhole and the recent security vulnerabilities, I see it as a company that's still trying to listen to their customers and do right by their customers, even though from the people who play the games don't see it that way. But from my perspective in servers, I see it that way.
Well, I think that's a great thing to end on for this episode, a perfect ending point there. Unless you have anything else you want to talk about, but if you don't, please. Well, I guess you don't really have anything to plug, do you? Like a website or anything.
I actually have a very interesting coincidence yesterday. I actually had to go to a computer retail store because I had to bring what was a retired Ryzen machine out of retirement because I had to use it for another company. So I had to bring that, and I have to have separate desktops for each network for security. So I can't mix the two up. But I actually met, and if you can believe it, an actual Intel employee who actually worked on servers, on the server, both client and servers at the store. It's like, so, we talked about it, and one thing that's impressed me was the fact that even he is recommending to both companies and individual consumers to buy AMD, even as an Intel employee. He's saying that their Xeons are having execution problems, reliability problems, and execution problems. And he says that if you need the stability, I'm impressed by his honesty, bluntly. But he mentioned about going by AMD servers, and
this is an ex-Intel employee or someone who works there currently?
A current Intel employee.
Wow. Openly said, obviously he's not at work, but he told you honestly just buy AMD is what he would recommend, even though he works at Intel right now.
So we kind of got into a discussion about my experiences and of others, and I talked about my experience. So he was actually writing down notes, and at the conclusion of it, he was basically saying that, and he also mentioned that the accelerators, he even thinks that they're dumb because the customers he talked to says they don't use them. So one of the problems that we're discussing is that Intel is not listening to their market. So he's writing notes on my experiences and the experience that I know from others about the Spectre meltdown and how the fact that it has really impacted us and forced us to, whether delayed or not, gone to Epic, your competitor. And once we're there, it's kind of hard to go back. And so basically he's going to bring it up to when he goes back to management. I don't know if he's going to make much headway with them, but it was really, really interesting. I'm heartened by his honesty. The only thing is saying that they're trying to fix the Raptor Lake and try to make it good for everyone. But he definitely agreed that currently the AMD products are definitely just better.
I mean, Intel marketing will say whatever they want to say, but obviously I talk to a lot of people who work at Intel for my job, and they're honest with me. Almost always. I mean, I think people expect them to be fanboys or trying to mislead me, but most of these engineers are straight shooters. They just like tech, whether it's from their own company or not. And if you ask them, do you think this is competitive? They'll say, no, this isn't competitive with AMD, and we know it. And it's interesting, though, to hear someone say that to you in person, honestly. Yeah. That really tells you something about how they feel right now.
Yeah. I don't think any of us are happy about what happened to Intel. I mean, we weren't happy with Intel with regards to this, the performance loss on the servers, because at the end of the day, this is our livelihoods. You're basically impacting our livelihoods. I can totally empathize with what Matthew from Australia,
Alderon Games,
yes, has gone through. I totally understand. We all feel the same way. We also are feeling sad for Intel as well, to see what happened to them.
I don't like seeing tens of thousands of people get laid off. It's terrible.
It's really tragic. It's they've been harmed by leadership, and I really think decades from now, that whole episode, that 25 years, this is 25 years in the making.
Yeah.
This is not something that just popped up. This is 25 years in the making. I think this is going to be a lesson in business leadership in business schools in the next decades to come.
Oh, for sure. Just like IBM was.
IBM. What
the
happened?
Auto industry.
What happened was they never developed the ability to listen to their market, because they've focused on capturing the market rather than earning the market. In the short run, you do get benefit from it, because the laws of physics, especially you're at the early part of the technology cycle, is on your side, because you can use brute force, and brute force works on the early part of the cycle. That's basically, you're talking about process technologies being, let's say, starting at 1 micron. That's what a 486 has. Going into the Armstrong, as you get higher and higher in the technology process, or more and more condensed on the process, the laws of physics is going to increase the cost, and you can no longer use brute force to outperform your competitors. You actually have to do competitive designs and clever designs. But to do that, you actually have to listen to your customers in terms of understanding what problem they're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
And Intel never really developed that cultural ability and the humility to listen to their customers, and thus when the laws of physics finally turn on them, that's when they start to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're seeing today. Ultimately, Intel's brought down by the laws of physics.
Jeez. Well, I'm glad you added that part. I really don't have anything else to add. That is quite a somber but excellent, I think, an important part. Should I say an impactful note to end on for this podcast. So, I don't have really much else to say. I really want to thank you so much for coming on again. I think this was fantastic. I'm sure we will have you on again at some point in the future as well. And I just want to remind everybody to subscribe to Moore's Law Zen on YouTube, ring the bell button, share this, comment below, tell your friends about this. All that helps so much. And then also, of course, support us on Patreon as well to get access to exclusive content and be able to ask fantastic guests like this questions as well. And thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, everybody. And have a good rest of your week, everybody.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here.
This podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, it's not just me. Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, renders being done by the industrial designer Jean-Philippe Clermont, and special assistance is also provided by Carmen Cry and Carrie Nosugad as well. Find all of our information at www.mooreslawsdead.com on the About/Support page page in the event you do want to hire me for consulting work, hire Gerard for audio work, hire Jean-Philippe for industrial design work, or you're interested in working with Carbon Cry or Carry No Sugata as well. You can also find our long-term sponsors on that page if you want to show them some love for putting food on our tables. Or you can also mail us some love. You can send letters or hardware donations to the following address: Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 60632 in Nashville, Tennessee, zip code 37206. Although, to be honest, the best way to show Moore's Law is Dead some love is to support us on Patreon. Patrons are what makes Moore's Law is Dead content truly possible. Every month, and really every day, depending on who you're talking about, me, Gerard, Dan, and Jean-Philippe are working tirelessly to provide a steady stream of content that we could not keep doing unless we knew the work was possible without being reliant on sponsors dictating every little thing we put out. Don't get us wrong. We love our sponsors, but we love directly working for you, our fans, much more. If you have any extra money, even a couple free dollars a month, consider supporting us directly on Patreon. Those couple of monthly dollars will get you access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to ask guest questions, and of course, access to the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who I am sure would love to meet you. I am one of them. Additionally, higher tiers get access to early, ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the ability to ask questions in all Broken Silicon episodes and Loose Ends live streams ahead of the recording, and the entire back catalog of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, in addition to having thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts depending on the tier, with other perks available as well. And hey, if you cannot afford to support us directly every month, please do share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family, and on social media and websites like Reddit, and give Broken Silicon a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast app of choice. All of this does really help us so much. But like I said, this podcast would not be possible without the patrons directly providing predictable and reliable support every month. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher supported levels:
Brad Medlin, Drita Foles, Z Jits, Daniel D, Aaron Close, Jan Rauner, Deke, Nicholas Buckner, Daniel High, GZ Ziggy, MJB1, SNES Chalmers, Jem Ferrier, Valco Malev, Jensen Wayne, Greggy S. Acker, Sarcastro, Toka, Chris Rich, Compressed AI Blocks, 3DS Boy 08, Halbuma, Shredbird, Holden Mobley, Samuel Loss, Jordan Simkovic, Julian Leak, The Boss Haas, Jonathan, Franco Frederic, Jake Dude 23, Jake Martin, Zlicky, Chrysantine, Christopher A. Butler, Stephen Hart, Meat and Pork, Tim Robb, Ian Clifford, Travis Gooding, Neithra Zink, Mad, Zoot Taylor, Stephen Coates, Greg, Michael McGee, Patty Cakes, Gamers Unite, Amiable Chief, Mark Mitchell, Tommy, I Should, Mark Raidmaker, James Anderson, Cole Addict, Cameron, Henry Zhang, Wesley Zazier, D31337 Antics, Michelle Bell, Jamie Witters, Hexapuma, Reginald Ari, Teak Autumn, Jeff Sedler, Windstar, Mai Sharona, Corey Leonard, James I, Raider, JSMH, Little Germany, Shay, Milton, Pulse Media, Melodic Warrior, Brett Jones, Chuck Glidden, Mac Daffy, Stephen Dick, Win Wang, Dave Schultz, Austin Haggerty, Justin Bussell, Joe Foot, Brian Scanlon, Hardland, Jansen Angima, Joseph Kelly, Sleshpaw, Himsig Gung Tales, 2299, Meal, Val Verga, John, Sisyphos 771, The Forbidden Juice, RB Racer, Brian Wright, AC, Alex Vega, Dr. J Mad, Free D, Michael Cosi, John Swin, Crystal Joe, Elbergun, Jola Martina, Kikam Solarize 80, Gian Violi, Matthew Marlowe, Thalo 215, Jeffrey Janiman, Lord Starstream, Brian P, Hoodat 42, Cornster 671, Penta Winta, Rowan McKickey, Sprutnik, Angel of Cake, Omega Doge, Mr. Tiger, John Wick, Boomsick, Porcelain Oats, Swaggins Curry, King 3, Nick, Sizmania, Sakosha, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.